The tension was barely concealed the moment Prince Harry stepped onto the stage of Late Night with Seth Meyers. The applause thundering with excitement while Harry, dressed in a fitted navy suit and a guarded expression, waved politely to the audience and shook Seth's hand with just enough firmness to seem cordial, but not overly enthusiastic. And the opening moments of the interview went off without a hitch. The usual pleasantries exchanged as they joked about Harry's beard maintenance and life in California. But it didn't take long for the atmosphere to shift once Seth steered the conversation toward the British monarchy, specifically Harry's decision to publish his controversial memoir and the ongoing fallout between him and the royal family. And while Harry had undoubtedly anticipated some form of questioning, it was the tone that caught him off guard. Seth's line of questioning wasn't playful or curious, but clipped, editorialized, and at times accusatory, referring to Harry's decision to leave his royal duties as a well-timed PR maneuver, and implying that his advocacy work was strategically Americanized, a phrase that visibly tightened the prince's jaw. And Harry, maintaining his composure, responded with deliberate clarity. What I stepped away from wasn't duty, it was a system that refused to evolve. And yes, I did it loudly because silence had already cost too much. But Seth, emboldened by the studio's live energy, pressed further, asking if Harry ever considered the psychological cost of dismantling centuries of tradition for personal freedom, a question that prompted a slight murmur from the audience and a sharp turn in Harry's tone as he replied, "The psychological cost is exactly why I left High Watch to consume my mother. I saw what it does to those who stay," and the room grew still, a silence that lingered for a beat too long before Seth, sensing he might have pushed too far, tried to pivot by joking, "But you're still making money from it, right?" Drew an awkward chuckle from a few audience members, but not from Harry, who sat back and said, "Is that what this is, then? An interrogation about profit? Or is it about why honesty from a royal is more uncomfortable than silence from an institution?" And with that, the back and forth transformed into a verbal standoff, with Seth attempting to regain control of the narrative while Harry, with each sentence, peeled back another layer of curated media expectation, challenging not just the questions but the system they represented. And things reached a breaking point when Seth, perhaps rattled or determined to push a headline-worthy moment, made an offhanded remark suggesting that grievance had become Harry's brand, to which the prince stood up mid-segment, removed his lapel mic, and said with calm finality, "Privilege clearly remains yours," before walking off stage to stun silence from the crowd and visible confusion from the producers. Scrambling behind the scenes, and in the minutes that followed, Seth attempted to salvage the segment with light commentary and a commercial break. But the story had already escaped the studio walls, spreading like wildfire across social media and news cycles worldwide, with headlines declaring Prince Harry walks out on Late Night and debates erupting over whether Seth Meyers had crossed the line or simply asked the questions everyone else was too afraid to voice. And Harry, meanwhile, released a short video the next day from a nature reserve in Kenya, where he'd flown immediately after the interview, calmly stating, "Dialogue requires respect without it. It's just performance," a line that was instantly quoted in editorials and digital think pieces, sparking further reflection about the way media treats trauma when it's wrapped in royalty. And in the weeks that followed, both men faced fallout, Seth with declining ratings and public pressure to apologize, Harry with intensified scrutiny, but also overwhelming support from global audiences, tired of curated questions and institutional deflection. And when asked later in an NPR interview whether he regretted walking off, Harry responded, "I regret how expected my silence still is." And with that, the conversation changed again, not just about Harry or the monarchy, but about what it truly means to speak truth in spaces designed to make you palatable instead of powerful. The fallout from Prince Harry's abrupt walk-off on Late Night with Seth Meyers didn't end when the lights dimmed or the stage crew cleared his untouched tea from the side table. Instead, it expanded organically and unstoppably, across continents and algorithms, turning what was meant to be a conventional talk show appearance into an inflection point in the global conversation around media accountability, institutional power, and the limits of royal patience. And while Seth returned to his desk the following night with a carefully worded monologue, apologizing if the tone got out of hand. While still insisting that public figures must expect public scrutiny, many saw his remarks as tone-deaf and insincere, especially when contrasted with Harry's quiet but unflinching video response recorded beside a Kenyan baobab tree, where he spoke plainly into a handheld camera about the cost of enduring years of half-truths and sideways questions framed as objectivity. And the image of the prince, surrounded by red soil and open sky, stood in stark contrast to the sleek, scripted world of late-night television. And it was this dichotomy that began to capture public imagination, not just Harry versus Seth, but raw truth versus performative neutrality, exile versus empire. And as the media tried to reset the narrative by dragging up past controversies, Meghan remained publicly silent, focusing instead on community projects in Compton and Oakland, letting the headlines churn without interruption. And yet, behind the scenes, the Sussexes were not retreating. They were planning, consulting with trusted documentarians, authors, and activists to frame a much larger project, a series called Exiled Voices, intended not to defend Harry but to amplify the stories of others who had been pushed out, punished or silenced for telling inconvenient truths. And once the teaser dropped, set against minimalist black and white footage of whistleblowers, immigrants, activists, and trauma survivors, ending with a stark image of Harry silhouetted against the horizon, murmuring, "Sometimes you don't leave the system throws you out." The internet ignited once again, and meanwhile, within the walls of Buckingham Palace, senior aides reportedly scrambled to contain the global optics of the prince, now standing in cultural solidarity with those who had suffered under systemic silence. And leaked memos indicated that the firm saw Harry's growing platform not as a media nuisance but as a reputational threat. Because he was no longer telling just his story, he was becoming a vessel for thousands more. And with Exiled Voices quickly climbing to the top of streaming charts before its official release, networks and media outlets began revisiting their own formats and questioning how late night, a genre once synonymous with satire and surface charm, had failed to evolve in an era hungry for authenticity. And back at NBC, Seth found himself increasingly isolated, not canceled. Not villainized outright, but scrutinized under a lens he wasn't prepared for, as his past interviews were dissected for patterns of dismissiveness or subtle condescension. And while some loyal viewers defended him as simply doing his job, others pointed out that intention doesn't erase impact. And the moment that sealed the shift came not from Harry, but from one of the producers who had worked the Meyers segment, an anonymous op-ed published in Variety describing how during the pre-show meeting, certain lines of questioning were suggested as provocative enough to go viral, essentially confirming what many had already suspected, that Harry had been baited not for journalism, but for ratings. And when that article trended, Harry again chose silence, issuing no rebuttal, granting no interview, allowing the facts to shape themselves in the absence of spin. And soon enough, university panels, podcast forums, and town hall events began using the